James Boaden is a lecturer in the history of art at the University of York in the UK, and has been central to a project with which I'm also involved called Surrealism and Sexuality at the University of Manchester, where he's been a key organizer, most notably doing conferences called the Convulsive Nursery, Surrealism and Childhood Sexuality, and Sexuality and the Surrealist Sensorium. He's also completed, I think out now, a new article on Robert Rauschenberg. And his research focuses on the relationship between avant-garde film, in which I think he's really one of the experts, and in the United States. And he's also done a number of organized film screenings at both Tate Modern and the British Film Institute in London. Please join me in welcoming a promising young scholar, James Boaden.
Thank you, Jonathan, and thank you for inviting me. As you can see, the title of this talk is a little different to the one that's in the program, and there will be some portraits in amongst this, but primarily it's about domesticity in the 1950s, and hopefully it should have some resonance with quite a few of the images upstairs, not just the ones by Jess, but some of the other artists as well. And also make you think about what's kind of missing from some of those depictions as well, namely the depiction of the home. You can count on like one hand the things that are set in domestic interiors. Okay. Histories of urban gay and lesbian life in the United States at mid-century are generally divided between accounts of the emergence of an organized homophile politics and the concurrent communities spawned by the bar culture of the time. This division is presented as marked along one side by the adoption of a series of normative values, and on the other by a celebration of social transgression. This is a binary that's more than familiar within queer debates surrounding gay marriage today. Socio-historical accounts of the 1950s emphasize aspects of queer life for which there is quantifiable, available data, providing only tantalizing glimpses into more private worlds, which would significantly nuance the binary of transgression and normative citizenship that have been presented. In the 1950s, those within long-term queer relationships had no available model to follow. Each decision about living together was constantly negotiated, in stark contrast to the underlining of hegemonist gender norms for straight families and the mass culture of the time. In this paper, I'd like to look at the way in which one highly exceptional couple began during the 1950s to present their daily domestic lives to a small coterie of friends as an alternative to both ideas of normative citizenship and outcast transgression. Burgess Collins arrived in San Francisco not as an artist, but as a disheartened nuclear scientist. He'd worked on the Manhattan Project in the early 1940s, manufacturing plutonium. In 1949, having been shown terrible films chronicling the destruction wrought by the bombs dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, Collins dreamt that the world would end in 1975. Giving himself only 26 years to live, he decided to follow his ambition and become an artist. He renounced his given name in favor of the ambiguous Jess and enlisted at the California School of Fine Arts. At around that time, in 1949, Jess met the poet Robert Duncan, who'd also changed his name as an act of severance from his mother. Like Jess, Duncan also lived under the aegis of an apocalyptic prophecy given to him at birth by his occultist adoptive parents. They believed that the child, whose mother had died in childbirth, had not been reincarnated since Atlantis and would see terrible destruction within his own lifetime. With this kind of synergy, Jess and Duncan quickly fell in love and moved in together in the new year of 1951. During the earliest years of their friendship, Jess lived in a large Victorian shared house at 1350 Franklin at Sutter Street, known locally as the Ghost House. The house was not only a home to artists such as Wally Hedrick and poets like Philip Lamantia, it was also a hangout. Hedrick recalls it as the kind of place where Thelonious Monk or Miles Davis might drop in, where drugs and parties were common. Duncan moved into the Ghost House briefly, sharing the ballroom with Jess. However, it became clear that they needed a life away from the noise and clutter of the crumbling flop house, which was reminiscent of the chaotic years that Duncan had spent hustling across the US in the previous decade. At that time, the filmmaker and poet James Broughton had just moved out of the building he shared with his lover, Kermit Sheets, in order to travel to Britain. This house was located at 1724 Baker Street in San Francisco, and it was part of a building that had survived the earthquake of 1906 and been passed from artist to artist ever since. The building housed the Centaur Press, which Broughton and Sheets had set up to publish the work of their friends, which included Duncan's writing. Before Broughton had lived there, the house had been occupied by a ceramicist who, Broughton tells us, painted the rooms of the house indigo, orchid, and purple. When Pauline Kyle had moved in with Broughton, she redecorated the apartment with Victorian side chairs, and she sewed stripes of Purple Heart ribbon from army surplus onto piano stools. Broughton writes, "My mother's baby ground was the only substantial furnishing." Such a bohemian setup was complemented by paintings by local artists, such as Lee Mulliken and Jean Varda, alongside the inlaid Moroccan headboard from Anaïs Nin's houseboat on the Seine. When Jess and Duncan moved in, many of Broughton's items remained in the house. It was not long, however, before the pair began to paint the house and fill it with their own objects. Duncan writes to Broughton and Sheets, "At Baker Street, gradually the temper of the old manse changed. Last month, the kitchen was transformed by Jess into a Collins painting. Today, he is at work on the bathroom. And my imagination is torn between the day-by-day invention of life here, imagination of rooms, of weather, le bonheurs of the good fire and the cozy table, the sleepy cat and the visit of friends." In another letter written to Broughton in the fall of 1952, Duncan details the new color scheme. Intense, brilliant Collins paintings in the dimensions of 4 walls, ceiling, and floor. 2 walls in hot tangerine orange, 1 wall in soft orange pink, and 1 in white, ceiling in white, floor in what the paint company with poetic inspiration calls Bermuda blue, woodwork in white and gold, center medallion in gold, from which a large Japanese lantern. The importance of place for Jess is recorded in his large leather-bound logbook, in which he recorded each of the artworks that he was making. Alongside the work's date, location, and title is a note of where it was painted. The first painting to be completed at Baker Street was a portrait of Duncan, entitled "The Door of Many-Colored Glass Opened, Imaginary Portrait No. 1, Robert Duncan." The large, full-length portrait shows the poet's body turned towards the house's interior, while his face is angled to the viewer. In his hands, he clutches a book against his hip. His other hand seems to be moving towards a large stained glass door, while 2 cats play beneath his feet. This portrait is a portal, almost the size of a door itself. It establishes the relationship between the artist and the subject as one of entry and passage. Inside, the house itself was an animated space. The filmmaker Lawrence Jordan has explained that using Jess's knowledge of the science of color, the house was painted so that as the sun passed over the building and lit certain walls in turn, the reflected colored light would then mix with the shade on the opposite wall. Such a scheme would make the very enclosure of the building seem alive, an effect only emphasized by the furnishing of the apartment with a number of anthropomorphic objects, such as vases in the shape of heads made by Miriam Hoffman. Stan Brackage's film In Between from 1955, which was filmed inside the house, emphasizes this sense of the uncanny, as Jess is depicted as menaced by old wooden toys and black melted candles light themselves on altars covered with dried artichokes. Jess's own works in assemblage from the time also attempt to revive outmoded and forgotten junk. Alfred Frankenstein, the San Francisco critic, wrote in 1953 of his exhibition at the King Ubu Gallery. His constructions of old light bulbs, feather dusters, discarded toasters, and similar junk delightfully recall the 1920s. Collins calls his whole display necrofacts, or dead art, but only the things employed are dead. The ends to which they can be put are rather magnificently wild. Although most of the works that the critic described are marked smasho in Jess's logbook, in that they were broken, they lay the foundations for his later assemblage lamp series from the early 1960s, which we're looking at here. Assembly Light 7 was used as a working lamp in the couple's home. It incorporates a cast iron dog chained to the base to prevent its escape, its thimble muzzle firmly jammed to its face. The lamp itself takes the form of a stylized flower growing from a sinuous Art Nouveau stem. Protruding from the side of the structure is an oyster shell, a tiny home of its own, which welcomes the viewer of the work with a toy teacup which is concealed inside it. An air of the occult is clear in Assembly Light 5 from 1961, which is constructed from a skull with the top removed, into which a light bulb has been placed. It's then all raised on a tripod and surrounded by a fringe of long beads. The top of the skull is suspended from a rusty armature and forms the base for a burning votive candle. The literally living rooms created by Jess and Duncan take clear inspiration from what Anthony Vidler has called the architectural uncanny, as it was developed within Surrealist practice between and actually during the Second World War. In 1952, Duncan and Jess clubbed together to buy a copy of Une Semaine de Bonté, The Week of Kindness, the last of Max Ernst's collage novels from 1934. Many of the scenes in Une Semaine de Bonté are set indoors, in the interiors of the previous century. The third part takes place almost entirely in a bourgeois parlor. Ernst's depictions of the 19th century interior chimed with the theorization of outmodedness and non-synchronicity in the work of a number of German cultural theorists writing in the 1930s, including Walter Benjamin, Ernst Bloch, and Theodor Adorno. The architectural theorist Siegfried Giedion communicated these ideas in the United States in the late 1940s. He wrote of a plate from the 8th chapter of Ernst's earlier collage novel, La Femme sans tête. Almost always, the atmosphere is of violence and death. From a glassed bookcase of the 1850s, La Femme sans tête, in the guise of a plaster bust, will perhaps fall out onto a learned bystander, while the stamped lion heads of the chairs come to life grimacingly changed into a giant ape. This was a view of living far from the ideal seen in the pages of Homes and Gardens. In 1951, Theodor Adorno, shortly following his year spent in California, wrote, "The house is past. The bombings of European cities, as well as the labor and concentration camps, merely proceed as executioners with what the imminent development of technology had long decided to be the fate of houses." Adorno goes on to remark that anyone seeking refuge in a genuine period-style house embalms himself alive. If the 19th century interior reflected the subject who lived within it, then to carry on living with this identity from an earlier century was to live with a corpse. During the interwar years, international modernist architects had attempted to do away with the dark dimensions of the 19th century home. Instead, they embraced a porosity and transparency in their architecture. While earlier, these dwellings were available only to the few, by 1950, their ideals were visible from the most basic suburban tracts right up to buildings conceived as modernist jewels. And here we're looking at an image of the Philip Johnson House, a very different idea of a queer interior around 1950. While, these houses did not allow dust to gather. These buildings were clean. These buildings could be run without servants. After all, there was nowhere to hide them. This was life on show, far from the idea of a shell-like dwelling beloved by many previous theorists of space. The grand decorated houses of San Francisco, in contrast, were the suburban housewife's nightmare. Nooks and crannies were dust traps, attics held unknown secrets, and heavy fabrics soaked up damp and housed insects. Anthony Vidler has explained the appeal of modernist architecture in psychological terms. If houses were no longer haunted by the weight of tradition and the imbrications of generations of family drama, if no cranny was left for the storage of bric-a-brac once deposited in damp cellars and musty attics, then memory would be released from its unhealthy preoccupations to live in the present. Jess and Duncan, then, seem perversely to be cultivating this material trauma, spreading the objects of the past throughout their aging home. All of the houses occupied by Jess and Duncan are described as filled with the decadent artifacts of the Belle Epoque. These pieces surfaced frequently in San Francisco as many houses had been rebuilt and decorated after the earthquake of 1906, which had erased objects of the more distant past. San Francisco in the 1950s was undergoing the first significant overhaul since the earthquake, as many of the slum areas were being demolished, sending a veritable booty of objects to the thrift stores and dumpsters of the city. many artists of the era remember fondly the second-hand stores of McAllister Street, which appear in photographs by Wallace Berman and in James Broughton and Sidney Peterson's film The Potted Psalm. Jess and Duncan began collecting fine objects of glass and porcelain. Many of the picture frames salvaged during this time now frame Jess's collages. It's not insignificant that the style moderne was the bête noire of modernist architecture and was celebrated by the Surrealists. Adorno's reading of Surrealism, written in 1953, argues that the movement's most effective work does not merely illustrate the Freudian fetish, bringing back objects from the past which screen some kind of traumatic encounter, but rather develop from Marx's concept of commodity fetishism, where they unmask outmoded desires for the object produced within capitalism. Adorno suggests that the objects utilized by the Surrealists do not come from the phantasmatic world of the unconscious, but from the physical realm of childhood. Making particular reference to Ernst's collage novels, he remarks, "What Surrealism adds to illustrations of the world of objects is the element of childhood we lost when we were children. Those illustrated papers, already obsolete even then, must have leapt out at us the way Surrealist images do now." Despite Adorno's protestations against a Freudian reading, as Hal Foster has suggested, this idea of returning to the child's viewpoint takes the idea of the outmoded, the strange objects of the past that litter Ernst's collages, into the realm of the uncanny. It's possible then to note comparable effects in the animated furniture of Ernst's collages and the glowering presence of Jess's assemblies. Both bring together the uncanny and the outmoded. Hal Foster unites the same two terms in order to examine Ernst's collage novels. He suggests, following Freud, that both of them come from a kind of return of the repressed. Foster writes, "In short, these stuffed interiors are literally convulsed. But by what exactly? What is the repressed of this architecture, of this epoch, as registered in these rooms? One answer is obvious enough: sexual desire." The 19th century's sexual fascination and its mirror in supposed repression may provide a correlate to the hiding and seeking of homosexuality in the immediate post-war years. Culturally, homosexuals, so often presented as outsiders, would just not seem to occupy stable dwellings during the 1950s. And I'd like to illustrate this claim with a single example that Jess and Duncan knew, the film Fireworks, made by their friend Kenneth Anger in 1947. In this film, Anger plays a lonely youth who goes out to look for a light and meets a bunch of erotically presented sailors who beat and brutally mutilate him. The beating is staged as a sexualized ritual, as milk is poured over Anger's body while sparks cascading from a burning Roman candle positioned in a sailor's crotch form one of the film's closing images. The film ultimately ends as it began, in Anger's bed, but now with two figures lying in slumber rather than one. Anger has succinctly explained its structure. A dissatisfied dreamer awakes, goes out into the night seeking a light, and is drawn through the needle's eye. A dream of a dream, he returns to a bed less empty than before. The sailor had long been a prominent figure in the homoerotic imaginary. You can see a lot of them in the show upstairs. An itinerant figure occupying a space on board ship, a space defined by Michel Foucault as the heterotopia par excellence. Alongside prisoners and bikers, sailors would form the wayfaring protagonists of an entire epoch of queer cinema, all drifters with no home of which to speak. The representation of sailors, Allen Ginsberg's human seraphim, is not the only way in which Fireworks figures homosexual homelessness. The youth's home is depicted as part bedroom, part public toilet. The door to the room has a large sign reading "Gents," while shots of urinals are swiftly cut into scenes of the room. The homosexual as nocturnal hustler would grow as a theme in literature both sympathetic and condemnatory towards deviant sexuality in the following decade. Think of Ginsberg's Howl, with its protagonists dragging themselves through the Negro streets and sat up smoking in the supernatural darkness of cold water flats. The rough and tumble of these often temporary spaces of transgression contrasts firmly with the delicacy of Jess and Duncan's space of secure dwelling. A letter from Duncan to Denise Levertov describes how this contrast was tested in 1956. Jess, who is more seriously alarmed by public-mindedness than I am, and by the assaults of brotherhood, threw Alan and Peter out of the house when they came to see me. That's Allen Ginsberg and Peter Orlovsky. The filmmaker Lawrence Jordan, who lived for a while in the house, glosses the story 40 years later. They describe themselves as strictly bourgeois. Robert says, "We are bourgeois, we like to live in a nice house, we like to have nice things, we like to cook, we revere the gods of the hearth." And they didn't like Ginsberg because he didn't understand things like chairs. Jordan goes on to remark, they had a very delicate, very powerful magic in their house that could turn a young artist completely onto the world of the magic of art. And this could be destroyed by someone who tramped through with heavy boots. So Jess wasn't about to allow that to happen. The comment in Duncan's letter about Jess's fear of the assaults of brotherhood is particularly striking, suggesting that whilst this was a household open to invited guests, any fictions of universal togetherness, either the brotherhood of poets or homosexual men, were treated with suspicion. In the early 1950s, Jess's work began to visualize the kind of outlaw sexuality represented by Anger's filmmaking. The best known of these works is upstairs, The Mouse's Tail, a large-scale collage which uses a host of imagery from physique photography in order to create the crouching figure of a man. The muscled bodies with their skimpy posing pouches intertwine, sometimes sharing a head, at other times grasping into one another's crotch. At the figure's knee, and again towards the ankle, we see a headshot of the artist himself, his mustached and goateed visage grinning broadly. In a letter from May 1956, James Broughton offered to buy Jess's famous old collage of nude boys if he's willing to part with it, going on to mention, "There was also a boy party painting I quite liked." The artist replied immediately, noting that the collage was sold, but that he would make a new one soon if he could get hold of the raw material, which had significantly increased in price. Whilst living in the UK, Broughton was sent physique magazines from America by his lover Kermit Sheets. In 1953, Sheets wrote to Broughton, "Glad you like the new physique mags. Aren't they a scream? I shall try and send you the little monthly one. I absolutely adore it. However, both are so obviously slanted for a clientele that has absolutely no interest in building up their own muscles, but in simply seeing pictures of beautiful youngsters. Why should I write at length of my impressions of America when a few tidbits like these can do it directly?" It's clear then that like the physique magazines, The Mouse's Tail is a work for those who like to see pictures of beautiful youngsters. The other work that Broughton mentions in the letter is even more graphic in its depiction of queer sexuality. Boy Party resembles many of Jess's early paintings in its crude figurative style and chalky impasto paint facture. In the foreground stand two male figures locked in an embrace, one of whom has been identified as the painter Norris Embry, who was Duncan's former lover. Behind them stand two men who also embrace while dancing, their faces obscured as they kiss. Further back, three figures dance with much more force than those in the foreground. They look like reeling male maenads, the bacchanalian theme only underlined by the fact that one of the men dances without his shirt, whilst another is entirely naked and sporting an erection. In the final layer of the composition, we see behind a colonnade a number of male figures of various ethnicities engaged in numerous sexual acts in both couples and groups. It's been often stated that the explicit depiction of homosexual acts was impossible in the 1950s due to the widespread oppression of queer sexuality in the decade. Jess's painting occupied both a public space in the King Ubu Gallery, which he founded with Duncan, and also a private realm inside his own home, where such works could be admired by a small group of intimate friends. Broughton's interest in the painting indicates that it was visible at least to those close to the pair. That such imagery of queer desire was to be traded amongst a tight group of comrades is underlined by the sequence of collages that Jess included in a book prepared for Broughton's birthday in 1956. Contained alongside an illustrated poem by Duncan inside a book labeled A Birthday Pillow Book for James are several collages that begin with a frame bearing the title Nance. A comic strip is used to provide the illusionistic space of the image into which are placed carefully cut out figures which match its graphic style. The strips on which Nance is based are from Lance, which was illustrated, written, and self-syndicated by Warren Tufts between 1955 and 1958. It was one of the last syndicated full-page newspaper strips and concentrated on stories of the Old West. These stories often featured moments where the hero needed to save his buddy from the line of fire. By placing naked male torsos from stories showing soldiers swimming at sea into strips depicting cowboys riding horses in the desert, Jess created surreal erotic effects. The slumped body of a semi-drowned man in the arms of his comrade becomes a scene of explicit homoerotic desire. Placed in amongst several other semi-naked and or swooning men, the image begins to resemble the orgy of Boy Party. The paintings and collages that Jess had completed in the years before 1954 rarely engage with homoerotic themes, so some explanation for the turn to this material might be found in the increased visibility of queer life in San Francisco that year. Charges for sexual offenses in San Francisco leapt in 1954 as policing was stepped up in the city, and homosexual acts were linked with that rise. The San Francisco Examiner from June 1954 wrote, "There must be sustained action by the police and district attorney to stop the influx of homosexuals. Too many taverns cater to them openly. Only police action can drive them out of the city." They didn't do a very good job. But this action in 54 was soon to follow, and cruising grounds such as parks, beaches, and baths were targeted throughout the summer, with several bars in the city being raided or having their liquor licenses investigated. Although Jess and Duncan rarely frequented the bars and clubs of the city themselves, they knew plenty of people who did, such as their colleague Jack Spicer, and could not fail to be aware of the very public clampdown in operation. Such restrictions severely limited the places in which homosexual men could convene socially, and with the introduction of undercover policing, a culture of suspicion was instigated. Jess, in his kaleidoscopic images of intertwined, multiplied bodies, creates a sense of promiscuous freedom at odds with the world outside. Michael Rumacher was one of the many young poets to be pulled in by the centrifugal force of the household. In his memoir, Rumacher provides a fluent description of what kind of space Jess and Duncan had made and what effect it had on a young gay man. And this is Rumacher at some length. Duncan knew the horrors and fragmentation of street life for a gay male and took care that his friendship with Jess and their home together remained intact and central in a deep instinctual sense of commitment, in one whose sensual energies and attentions streamed everywhere. It literally kept him off the streets I haunted. I searched outwardly for what Duncan had carefully and wisely made for himself, his own necessary enclave to work and live in. I watched to learn his secret, yet couldn't get to it or get it down. Duncan gave to me and to others a sense of what liberation could really mean, not as sexual licentiousness, as cock addiction and the numbers game. He taught me there's no freedom without walls. Duncan himself wrote in 1972, quoting from Lorca, "Today I see love in that household in which I live, as I saw it in its beginning 20 years ago, as a homestead I and my companion there would create, even pathetically within man's nature, sheltered by our imaginary humble lives from the eternal storm of rage." And that final sentence is the Lorca. The storm of rage was seen as the passion brewing in the confusion of life lived as a homosexual in an intolerant society. Here, we plainly see the distinction between love within the home and the vagrant outcast sexuality that characterized the lives of so many in the 1950s. It's not difficult to read into this account the concurrent history of the homophile movement, which was beginning to gather its forces in the very city Jess and Duncan had settled in. However, the life that Rumacher describes is far from the conservative vision of coupledom envisioned by the Mattachine Society and others. The Mattachine vision suggested a model of homosexual life molded from heterosexual domestic norms, which by the mid-1960s were themselves beginning to be challenged as a form of enslavement. The sheer strangeness of Jess and Duncan's house would never have met their criteria for blending into the norm. Rumacher continues from the paragraph I just quoted and arrives at the heart of this conflict. "But it's important that the walls are of your own making, not those imposed from without by others, to exist and work in openly and comfortably in expansive affection and vitality, the space to move and make in, Home, that most powerful word in all that that means. The home that Jess and Duncan had made was an uncanny one which seemed to conceal the secrets of the past. This effect was achieved through the use of outmoded furnishings that found themselves reflected in Jess's artworks. Anthony Vidler suggests that one of the ways in which the house becomes uncanny, particularly in the ghost stories that characterize romantic fiction, is through the idea of heritage and inheritance, that a house stands like a family tomb, a container haunted by the weight of tradition and imbrications of generations of family drama. Jess and Duncan seem to build their own fictional heritage in their homes at the very moment they sever themselves from the brotherhoods of poets, homosexuals, and their own families. To stress the uncanny within their homely shelter is to suggest a form of parody, to ask, is it possible to shelter in the past? Jess and Duncan paint themselves as masters of an uncanny realm, Jess going so far as to paint a portrait of Duncan as the enamored mage, an occultist priest at work over a makeshift altar of burning candles, ostrich feathers, and Tiffany glass. To suggest that Duncan and Jess achieve an omnipotence within the homestead is to suggest a rare and measured control over the storm of rage that spun about them. Thank you.